This is Away, Series 2, a podcast for anyone interested in a fresh approach to 12-step recovery. I'm your host, Steph Roberts. This is episode 8. Hi all! In case you noticed and thought, what the fuck, I decided to change up the podcast cover art, although saying art makes me feel ridiculous since it's just a photo of me with away written next to my head. Anyway, I decided to change it because why isn't my face attached to this? I'm not anonymous. I'm not trying to hide from anyone or anything. So there you go. That's me. I've also changed up the music because why not? I love the other opening piece called Electronic Vibes by Scott Holmes, which you can buy at scottholmesmusic.com. But I also really like change. So I hope you're on board. The new song is Born Twice by Mark Tracy. If you like it, you can find more of his music online. He has a great album called Touch the Earth available on Amazon. The name of the song also seems fitting for us, since many of us feel like we've got a second chance at life. Anyway, even before I got sober, I liked change. Some change. I've always liked to change things like my hair color, my style of my clothes. I love to move my furniture around all the time, spray paint old furniture into completely new crazy colors. I'm always down to try new things. I'm not tooting my own horn, although it's tootable. I'm just saying I like to change things up a little. And I mean, that's pretty much the underlying theme of this, of sobriety, of the big book, of life. In my opinion, a good life is in big part characterized by willingness to change, open minds, to try something new. And it's kind of what the writers of the big book were saying too. When it's all said and done, they were just outlining the stuff that helped them to change. And it turns out a lot of what they suggest can help in a lot of different areas of life. But for that terrible, horrible, no good, very bad writing. Anyway, as you know, we'll talk about this again when we reach the steps themselves. Now, let's move into the second part of More About Alcoholism, page 35. We're going to read Jim's story, but I'm actually going to change the name to Juliet, as well as change the corresponding pronouns. It's a trick my husband taught me. He does it when he does big book studies, and it's totally great because, you know, there are a lot of us gals now in AA. And I'm going to update it just a little, the language. Anyway, just listen. The basic premise of the story will not change. Our first example is a friend named Juliet. This woman has a lovely family. She inherited a lucrative publishing company. She is a great marketing strategist. Everybody likes her. She's an intelligent woman who suffers from some anxiety, but nothing that appears too serious. Juliet didn't drink very much at all until she turned 35, but in just a few years, she became so vicious when she drank that she became a threat to her family, and she was sent to an inpatient rehab. It was there that a few people from AA met her. They told her what they knew about alcoholism, including the tools they'd use to recover. Juliet returned from rehab with a renewed sense of hope. She worked hard to bring her family back together and get back on track with her business. Everything was going really well, but she drank again. The people from AA spoke with her after her relapse. She knew she was a real alcoholic. She knew that her condition was serious and getting worse. She knew that if she didn't sober up, she could lose everything, including her family. And still, she drank again. When she was asked to explain how the last bender started, she said this: "I went to work on Tuesday morning. I was annoyed because I had to go out to meet a client who had once been an employee of mine. I decided that it would be better to walk to the meeting than drive, with city traffic being as bad as it is. Walking would take a bit longer, so I left only an hour or so later. On the way, I realized I hadn't eaten anything, so I stopped at a cafe. I sat at the bar since I had to make it quick. I had no intention of drinking. I ordered a house salad and a Diet Coke. Still hungry, I ordered a fruit salad and another Diet Coke. Suddenly, the thought crossed my mind that a shot of rum in the Coke wouldn't hurt me with a full stomach. Some small part of me knew it wasn't a great idea, but I reminded myself I'd just eaten, so it should be fine. I felt fine after the first shot, so I ordered another Diet Coke and rum. And so began Juliet's next trip to rehab. Even the threat of losing everything wasn't enough to stop her from taking a drink. She had so much experience and knowledge about herself and her problem. She fully understood the risk, but all of it was easily pushed aside because drinking on a full stomach would be fine. There are all kinds of fancy words to describe it, but in the end, it's just insanity. What else could it be? Her sound reasoning failed to hold her in check. The insane idea won out. The next day, she, like all of us, asked herself, how did it happen? Okay, so I like the story of Fred, or Jim, I'm sorry. In our case, Juliet, for one real reason. I identify with the what the hell happened feeling. Hold on, I'm feeding my dog while I'm here. My last night drinking was the night before the christening of the daughter of a very good friend. Let's call my friend Charlotte. I had a second date the night before with a guy from, I think, Plenty of Fish. My plan was to meet him for a drink or two at the bar where he was starting out the night with friends for a birthday party, and then I'd go home. Before I even left the house, I'd had a glass of wine, and then before I met him, I met up with another friend. I'll call her Emma. Emma and I had quite a few drinks together, and of course, Emma accompanied me to meet the guy. She and I went on after the quote-unquote date to another bar at which I was a regular. There, we met up with a few of my other party pals. As ever, we closed the bar and went on to yet another friend's house to keep partying. That's code for doing coke and drinking all night, among other things. At 6 a.m., I began the long walk home. Emma came with me. I couldn't keep it together. I couldn't be alone. Some part of me was terrified, but I didn't know what of. I was crying and yammering on about going to my friend Charlotte's daughter's christening. I kept saying, I have to go, I have to go. But no part of me felt capable of going. I just have to stop for a minute because remembering this night is it's still really painful. Emma had to calm me down, and she had to work really hard to drive home the point that I absolutely could not go into a church in the state I was in. So we picked up her dog, and she came to my house and slept on my couch, her dog terrifying my cats, not on purpose, while I cried and shook in bed. Guilt for letting down Charlotte, shame over the night before, eating away at me. The story itself isn't remarkable in the sense that I'd done the same thing many times before. I'd let people down I loved more than Charlotte many times before. But it's the story that always comes to mind at this point in the book because it fits so precisely. It didn't matter that I had made a commitment to a dear friend or that it was a particularly meaningful event. Nothing mattered more than drinking once I took a drink. I can't say that what would have happened if I hadn't had a drink that night. Chances are I would have shown up for the christening and had drinks at the party later and gone on to an all-nighter after the christening. I'm glad I didn't do that. It was the shame I felt the next morning, unable to sleep because the hangover was so uncomfortable, tossing and sweating and wishing I was dead. If not for that, I may still be drunk. For me, it's a fact. Nothing mattered enough to say no until saying no became the norm. I don't know if that even makes sense. Nothing mattered enough to say no to alcohol until saying no was what I did to alcohol. In order for things to matter enough to stop me from drinking, I first had to stop drinking. I first had to concede that I was an alcoholic who could never drink safely, and I had to seek and take help for the problem. So it was when abstinence became my norm that I became a better friend, daughter, etc. I could show up for people. I could show up for life. I could show up for myself. Just showing up alleviates a great deal of shame and self-loathing. Okay. Ooh, I got so emotional. I got emotional thinking about it today, too. And it was so funny because right as I was thinking about this story today, thinking about doing this episode and jotting down the notes, and it's especially funny for an atheist, so right as I'm writing it down, Emma actually texted me, and it was with a link to Miley Cyrus's song Party in the USA. She and I are still great friends. She is not an alcoholic, does not have a problem, and is incredibly supportive and always has been of every change I've made. And in fact, she was my personal trainer when I lost all the weight. So I owe her many debts of gratitude. And she texted me, I just love remembering every time I hear this song how we both admitted we loved it and that it geared us up and put us in a good mood. And that immediately took me out of my sad space. So I guess I'm reiterating it now to lift myself out of the sad space again. All right, anyway, so the chapter goes on to look at some of the reasons we've given or excuses we've made for drinking. Mostly, the book says, to handle an uncomfortable emotion like anger or jealousy. And that's true for a lot of people, but we also drink for a lot of other reasons. This is when you hear people in AA say things like, you drink at your boss. And that means like you were angry with her, so you drank. And then they may say, and who got hurt? So the point is, you did. You drank at someone, but the only person who got hurt was you. The other person didn't get hurt by your drinking. I mean, and you could nitpick this and say, well, if it's my mother, it hurt her, but not really. I mean, quite literally, you're drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, right? That's that whole saying. Anyway, let's read the jaywalker fable or analogy or whatever it is. I love it because it's so stupid, but also kind of genius, because it does seem like we're that crazy sometimes. Okay. Our behavior is as absurd and incomprehensible with respect to the first drink as that of an individual with a passion, say, for jaywalking. He gets a thrill out of skipping in front of fast-moving vehicles. He enjoys himself for the first few years in spite of friendly warnings. Up to this point, you might label him as a foolish chap having queer ideas of fun. Luck then deserts him, and he is slightly injured several times in succession. You would expect him, if he were normal, to cut it out. Presently, he is hit again, and this time has a fractured skull. Within a week after leaving the hospital, a fast-moving trolley car breaks his arm. He tells you he has decided to stop jaywalking for good. But in a few weeks, he breaks both legs. On through the years, this conduct continues, accompanied by his continual promises to be careful or to keep off the streets altogether. Finally, he can no longer work. His wife gets a divorce, and he is held up to ridicule. He tries every known means to get the jaywalking idea out of his head. He shuts himself up in an asylum, hoping to mend his ways. But the day he comes out, he races in front of a fire engine, which breaks his neck. Such a man would be crazy, wouldn't he? You may think our illustration is too ridiculous, but is it? We who have been through the ringer have to admit, if we substituted alcohol for jaywalking, the illustration would fit us exactly. However intelligent we may have been in other respects, where alcohol has been involved, we have been strangely insane. It's strong language, but isn't it true? I mean, I kind of agree. We know more now, right? We know more about the whys of addiction. And the book actually explores that a little further later, and later writings of Bill's talk about that. And we know a lot more now. So in some ways, it's not quite as insane. We know a lot more about brain chemistry and what alcohol or drugs were doing to that brain chemistry for a long time, and how the amygdala reacts to it. And opiates especially. I mean, you don't even have to have the quote-unquote addiction gene to become addicted to those, because they're giving your brain something so great, it just keeps craving it more and more and more. And the more you give it, the more it craves it. It's like a Pavlovian dog. It's just responding. If it thinks it can get it, it will. And in many ways, that's what happens in the alcoholic brain, too. It wants it, and then it needs it, and you've kept reinforcing the habit. I'm not blaming you, because once you're sort of in it, it feels impossible not to give into it. The obsessive thinking takes over. And that's the same thing they're saying for the jaywalker, right? I mean, it is a silly illustration, but I like that because it's sort of, if you can take that more objective look, this is what the people who've been talking to you about your problem, this is what they're seeing. They're seeing this person, if they don't understand addiction at all, to them it really seems like the jaywalker, right? If they do understand it, maybe a little less so, but because they're not addicts or alcoholics themselves, they will probably never fully understand what that obsessive compulsive behavior really feels like. The obsessive thinking that feels like you are absolutely going to go crazy if you don't give in to it. And so the compulsive behavior of drinking, right? And that's also where cognitive behavioral therapy comes in handy. And that's the steps for all intents and purposes. So this chapter is driving home with as many examples as possible the idea that we are powerless over alcohol, and that we need help to stop. You can't do it alone. Page 39, the quote we read, I think in the last episode too. But that is my one-eyed rescue cat, Jack, tearing something apart. And we're just going to let him because he has fun. Believe it or not, I have a really nice house, but the cats do have complete free reign. Okay, but the actual or potential alcoholic, with hardly an exception, will be absolutely unable to stop drinking on the basis of self-knowledge alone. All right, is this 100% true? Probably not. There are people who have stopped drinking without much help or with just a therapist's medication, and they're just fine. Hardcore AA members like to say kind of nonsensical things like, yeah, but they can't be happy. They must be white-knuckling their way through life, yada, yada, yada. I don't think that's true. But what is true, or at least is true for me, and maybe for you, is that I couldn't do it alone and I couldn't do it with a therapist. But I could do it with a group of people who had the same problem as I did. It's not the only way, but it is a way. Okay, the chapter then moves into the story of Fred, which we won't read now, but Fred is actually a real man. Now Jack's joining me. Fred is actually a real man named Bill Dotson. And if you've ever seen that painting of Bill and Bob talking to a man on a hospital bed, then you've seen Bill Dotson. He's the man on the bed. It's at the end of Fred, Bill's story, that the writers are driving home the spiritual aspect of all this again. Quote, the program of action, this is Bill, Fred, talking. The program of action, though entirely sensible, was pretty drastic. It meant I would have to throw several lifelong conceptions out of the window. That was not easy. But the moment I made up my mind to go through with the process, I had the curious feeling that my alcoholic condition was relieved, as in fact it proved to be. Quite as important was the discovery that spiritual principles would solve all my problems. Sniff, sniff. I have since been brought into a way of living infinitely more satisfying and, I hope, more useful than the life I lived before. My old manner of life was by no means a bad one, but I would not exchange its best moments for the worst I have now. I would not go back even if I could. Okay, we've talked about that before on this podcast. I really feel that way. Not everybody does. I would argue that if you take the drinking out, you will inevitably notice other things that need changing, and you'll be a lot more willing to change them because it won't seem so overwhelming. You've done this huge thing already, right? You've accomplished this thing. You set a goal to get sober, and now you're sober. So the next small goal won't seem as unachievable as it did when you came into this process filled with guilt, shame, remorse, self-loathing, misery, whatever. It just won't seem as hard. And it's with each of those changes that life gets better and better, in my opinion. The line, quite as important was the discovery that spiritual principles would solve all my problems. I mean, that just depends on who you are, what you believe. A lot of the basic principles that they're calling spiritual are sort of just guidelines to a good life in general. Treat other people the way you wish to be treated. Apologize when you're wrong. Take responsibility for the things you've done wrong and try to make them right. Be kind. Try not to contribute to other people's suffering. Don't judge. So those lessons, those life lessons, those ideas can come obviously from a spiritual practice. And it's my belief, as you know, that they're inherent within us. And that's what a very devout Christian might say is conscience. That is a God-given thing, and I believe it's inherent in the human animal, which is what makes us different from other animals who may not feel some of those things in the same way we feel them. Although I do think they do, but whatever, that's another philosophical discussion. Okay, so I am going to reframe that whole thing for you because it's actually that last part of his quotation, to my mind, that matters the least when the first and only goal is to stop drinking. A lot of those ideas of spiritual practices, be they be they spiritual in the sort of otherworldly sense or in the intellectual sense, emotional rearrangement, it's my opinion those really aren't necessary to begin the process. You have to be willing to turn your life, not your whole life, your drinking life, over to the group, over to other people who know how to do this better. Maybe later you're going to turn over more, but AA does not solve all your problems. And more than likely, no spiritual practice will either. You will, no matter what, have to take action. So I do think that last part matters the least when your first and maybe your only goal is to stop drinking. You may not have a life problem. You may only have a drinking problem. That's how I feel. I didn't really have a life problem. Drinking got me into some messes I had to get out of, but I knew how to live as a grown-up. I knew how to enjoy things. I knew how to be a part of life. That is not true for everyone, and AA provides a lot of different things for a lot of different people. I think it's the program of action that is the most important, more important than finding God. Because whether or not you believe in a higher power, you're going to have to do stuff, change stuff. So to my mind, the most important lesson we should take away from this parable, so to speak, is that two alcoholics went to another alcoholic, and it was only then that he felt empowered to get sober. Bill and Bob go to Bill Dotson, tell him about their experiences drinking and their experiences recovering, and that's what truly empowers him to get sober. You can have God in that equation, but those men still had free will. God perhaps guided them to him. I'm not saying you have to follow my atheist doctrine by any means, but they still took the action to go, to give him what they'd found. So when Bill Dotson took the suggestions of these two men who had the same problem, it worked better than anything else had, right? Empathy and sympathy, the right kind of empathy, I should say. You don't want a surgeon to feel empathy for the patient, right? But he could hear it better because he knew they got it. And a big part of that is also not feeling judged, right? Knowing that your shame is the same shame or similar shame to that of other people, that you're self-loathing. You're not unique in these things. That's very powerful. But I also want to take a minute because this story, as it's told in the book, can also be dangerous, right? That sentence again about spiritual practices fixing all your problems. Wouldn't that be great if AA solved all my problems? And that sort of feels like what they're saying. God or not, the program of AA does not solve all your problems. It gets rid of a major problem. A major problem that in and of itself created loads more problems. So some of those problems actually clear up relatively quickly when you put down alcohol, or at least you can manage them. But a whole host of other problems may become apparent for some of us. one of mine, my terrible depression, paralyzing anxiety, panic attacks, and obsessive compulsive thinking in other parts of my life. Neither AA or any supernatural higher power could solve those problems. A doctor with a medical degree who could prescribe Zoloft for me has done an excellent job along with Lamictal. And now I actually don't use a lot of talk therapy. I talk to friends in AA. If it's a bigger problem, I talk to more people with more knowledge than me. If something seems insurmountable, and certainly people in the rooms without degrees cannot be of much help to me on it, I will certainly seek some kind of talk therapy. Great shrink. AA, even without God, has done a wonderful job of getting rid of one of the biggest problems I had. And that has allowed me, and can allow you, no one else, to solve the other problems. And again, when I say problems, I don't mean defects of character, though some aspects of your personality may become hindrances. We've said that before, if it's defensiveness or bullying or perhaps being too withdrawn or being very shy or being overly accommodating in a way that is not beneficial to you, giving too much of yourself, not having a boundary there. All those things may become clearer. Some of them you may want or need to hang on to. That depends on your life situation. Of course, I want every woman to get out of an abusive relationship, but that's not always immediately possible. And you may have to hang on to some of those quote-unquote defects, which are really defenses or damages or things you've learned you need to make it through the world, through a day. So this is all much more nuanced than the book allows, and much more nuanced than a lot of the fundamentalists or ideologues or thumpers really understand themselves. And I suppose I do mean that to be somewhat judgmental. But in some cases it's willful ignorance, but in other cases it's just ignorance. And I use the word not to put them down, but you can't know what you don't know. You can't help people with things you don't understand. The problem, of course, is that some people think they know it all, even though it's just theory to them, and they may not even be that educated on the theory. It could just be pulled out of nowhere. We got a few of those in my husband's home group. Oh my God. Telling people how to live their lives when, they've still got rage issues. They've never dealt with their own sort of sociopathy or psychopathy. It's sort of unbearable to me. Anyway, people in AA, if they can't help you with a problem, are meant to say, I don't know. I don't have experience with that, and so I can't be of help. I can listen. I can support you. Perhaps we can go to other people who might have more experience with it. If you have a really big problem like thoughts of suicide, I beg of you to call a suicide hotline or go to a doctor and talk about it. People in AA are not qualified to do that, and they're not qualified to answer every question you have about everything, nor should they be trying. I want you to feel empowered in that, really. It is hard for many of us. I don't actually include myself in this because I don't shy from conflict, and I'm a pretty powerful personality. But I am very sympathetic to people who are quote-unquote people pleasers, who are shy, who are very afraid. I want you to be empowered to at least walk away or say, that's not right, or that's not my truth. And if you feel like you gotta lie, like, just say, I'll talk to my sponsor about it, or that's not what my sponsor said. You can say what you mean without saying it mean. That's something they say in Al-Anon, but I really like it. Like, this is a great opportunity for people who feel as if they haven't stood up for themselves enough or want to start learning that. We have a friend who has he was bullied in school, and he has very much learned those boundaries and how to treat himself with more respect and sort of insist, without being nasty, that other people show him respect. And if they don't, he doesn't need them in his life. It's very impressive, and it's definitely a place to learn that. AA is. Anyway, we end the chapter with, once more, the alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink. Now, I don't agree with that entirely. I think that once you've started abstaining, what was once a powerful urge or felt like a need is now a desire, but you have the power to choose. You should feel empowered by your free will. Except in a few rare cases, neither he nor any other human being can provide such a defense. His defense must come from a higher power. Totally get it if that's what you believe. I still don't think a higher power alone is enough in early sobriety. It may be helpful if there is no one else to call and no one you can reach out to for support in the beginning. It may be helpful to pray. If you don't believe in God, just take a minute, use the tools we've been talking about, the Think It Through tool. I really like that one because it brings me to, that painful memory of that night I just described, or, a place I never want to go back to, that I know in my heart, my head, every part of me, that one drink will bring me back there. And even if it's not the drink tonight, even if I maintain a certain amount of willpower, it sets off something in my brain. And so the desire to drink becomes a need to drink pretty quickly. Of course, I find this paragraph super annoying to me. But if I am to be mostly content, I do need to look at the things about which I'm grateful, right? So here they wrote higher power and not God. Take that to heart. Your higher power can be the group. I choose to read this as, I can't do it alone, but no one else can do it for me. That means I need to ask for help, and just the act of asking for help is an act of humility, and one that means by default, a power greater than you will emerge. For some, that's God, as well as the group. For me, it was only the group. Okay, on that note, excuse me, we'll finish up this episode. And as ever, I hope this helped in some small way. And I hope it's a reminder that no matter what, there is a way.